everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for tuning in. In this week's episode of Trailblazers Talk, I am speaking to the award-winning author, journalist and dedicated long-distance runner, Adharanand Finn. Many of you will have already read his books, such as Running with the Kenyans, The Way of the Runner, and my personal favourite, The Rise of the Ultra Runners. And I am so excited to get into this. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Nice to be here.
So you've dabbled quite successfully, by all accounts, in distances from 5 kilometres to, as I just learned, over 300 miles. But it seems to be other people's running stories and running cultures that interest you most. How did you get into writing about running?
So as a child, I was a runner, quite a serious runner. In fact, I even ran, I think my shortest run is probably 400 metres. I used to do 400 on the track. And I was quite serious. I was like county champion. I ran in the nationals. And that all kind of drifted away. And I had 3 small children. And I really wanted to get back into running, but I was a journalist at the time, and I noticed that Runner's World magazine did these race reports. I was living in the southwest of England at the time, and there weren't many coming from the southwest of England. I said, I noticed you don't do many race reports in the southwest. Could I do some? And they said, yeah, sure. And so then I started working for Runner's World magazine, writing race reports, and then I was saying to my wife, I'm doing these races, I have to train. So it was a kind of an excuse in a way to get back into my running. Like if it was work, then I had to do it, right? The first feature I ran, actually, I did one of these races for Runner's World just to write a report about the race. And they're short, simple reports about, you know, what the goodie bag was like, what the course was like. Yeah. But I actually won the race. So I said, hey, what about I write what it feels like to win a race? Because I was never expecting to win this race. And it was quite a mad experience. And my kids were there. And I remember crossing the line feeling like I'd won the Olympics or something. It was like incredible.
It is a great feeling, to be fair. So actually you seem to have found a brilliant niche because you combine your own personal stories of running at quite a successful level, but without being too out of reach from the general population, with the kind of cultural aspect of traveling around the world. So many people will have read your books, but for anyone who hasn't, can you tell us a little bit about what it is that makes the Kenyan runners so dominant at the marathon?
It's a simple question, a very complicated answer.
Well, you did write an entire book about it.
There's so many factors involved that it's kind of hard to kind of list them all, but the key ones are, so there's these factors which are lifestyle and environment. So they live in this beautiful place which is at high altitude, rolling hills, perfect altitude for running because if you live right up in the high mountains it's too high. And then the lifestyle, they all grow up leading these very tough lives. So all the children are running to school, running around barefoot, you know, going to fetch water, coming, herding the cows. No one's sitting around just, you know, wasting their time watching TV on their phones. I mean, this is probably changing now. Mobile technology is quite advanced in Kenya, and I must admit, this may be changing. And I have written articles actually about how this may be the end of the Kenyan success story.
Oh, interesting.
But what happens, but these factors exist all over the world. So what's different about Kenya and Ethiopia is that this culture has grown up around running. I feel like if you're in Peru or you're in Nepal and you're a subsistence farmer and your son comes in or your daughter comes in and says, I'm not going to help on the farm anymore, I'm going to become an athlete. Yeah. They're going to say, what are you talking about? Get back to work. Yeah. Well, in Kenya, if you come in and you say that to your family, they're like, oh my God, we have a runner. This is amazing.
Okay, so it is a cultural element.
So there's this feeling in that whole high altitude area that running is a serious way to be. And then what happens, you get more and more, it's a self-perpetuating thing. The more runners that do it, it becomes a numbers game, the more runners are there, but then they're also inspiring each other, running with each other, helping each other. Yeah. And it gets to the point where virtually every village in that whole Rift Valley area has got someone who's been to Europe or America or somewhere in the world, won lots of money. I mean, even if you won £5,000, you go back to Kenya, you're quite wealthy. Yeah. Built a house, and everyone's like, I want to be like them. I want to be, and that person's just there, so you can go and talk to them. Yeah. And he'll say, "Oh, come run with me. We're running tomorrow."
I love it. And now people from the West are going out there to train and becoming quite successful, as you did. You know, you got your PBs, but you got your PBs after coming back after 6 months.
Yeah,
is it?
6 months there. Yeah.
So that's very impressive. And then you wrote about Japan and Japanese running culture. How does the Kenyan running culture differ from the Japanese one?
Yeah, they couldn't be more different, weirdly. Japan have this amazing running system. They're completely obsessed by running. And they have these running teams, relay teams, and they're the biggest So one of the biggest sports in Japan is these ekiden, these relay races. And these teams are so big and they're well funded, and they sign up Kenyan and Ethiopian runners to join them. And there's a limited number. They can only have one running in each team, but they often sign up two so they can train together. A bit like British football teams will sign up Brazilian or Argentinian footballers. And I met one of these Kenyan runners, and he I thought his line was brilliant. He said, if the Japanese trained like the Kenyans, they'd break all the world records. And because they've got it all here. They've got the passion, they've got the money, they've got the numbers, they've got the same numbers of people coming into running. So he put it all down to the training, which I thought was really interesting. Not the genetics, not the lifestyle, not the altitude, but, and that doesn't mean he's right, but it was a really interesting that he felt like there was something completely wrong with the Japanese training. And I had a couple of other Ethiopians give me exactly the same thing. They had two problems. One, they said no forest. Now what they meant is that all the training in Japan is done on the concrete, on the tarmac. And this is, obviously there's a whole separate trail running scene in Japan. So I was looking at the professional road running scene. But the Kenyan marathon runners, the road runners, they all train on the trails. And the same in Ethiopia. All 95, 98% of the training is done on the trails. They will do the odd session on the road just to kind of get some good times and to sharpen up. So that was the first problem. So no trails. And it's true, the injury rate in Japan was crazy. Yeah. And the second reason, he said, is they train too hard. And this like blew my mind, because like you think this is a very Japanese idea, but it's also a Western idea that if you work hard, you get more out of it. The harder you work, the better you'll be. And it's very much fixed in the Japanese mind. Whereas the Kenyans know that in running, that's not true. If you train too hard, you're going to break.
Burn out,
And burn out and break. And so they very cleverly, they do these very slow runs. One of the things that surprised me in Kenya is how slow they do their slow runs. I'm an amateur runner, and I could run with them. In fact, for me, it was almost too slow, their slow runs. I was like, well, at first I thought they were having a joke with me. I was like, I'm not this slow, guys. And they were like, what? I'm like, you don't have to run this slow.
Are we talking like 6 minute per kilometre?
Yeah, or slower.
10-minute miles?
Yeah, 10-minute miles, 10, 11, 12-minute mile pace on some of the runs. And I'd be like, come on. And then I know this is how we run. When we go easy, we go easy. Because I used to only go on the easy runs. Right. I once turned up on the wrong day by mistake. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, and the guy comes over to me and goes, you know, today is fast. And I was like, oh. I said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll just try it, you know. For once, I'll try it. And they were doing 15K. So I thought, I'll just see how long I can keep up. And we started, they went like, okay, ready, go. And we got 100 yards up the road. There was a turning off to the left, to the right, and I just took it because I was sprinting. So they go fast and slow. Whereas the Japanese, what they do is they train much harder, much higher mileage, much longer runs. And so what they do, which you think would be good, but what the Kenyans guy was saying is it means they never do any proper speed work. Right. Because they're always tired. Their body's always tired. So when they come to do their quality sessions, they're exhausted. Yeah. Exactly.
So the lesson from that is very much like the 80-20 rule that we hear about all the time. Mostly you're running slow, and then when you do your hard days, do them properly hard. And I think you mentioned that in your book, that some of the coaches came in and tried to shift things around a little bit by, rather than doing 2 hard days in a row, do 1 hard day and then 2 easy days.
Well, I joined one of the teams just to observe them and write about them. And the coach was very interested in my experiences in Kenya. And he actually adapted their training as a result of what I told him the Kenyans were doing. He didn't have any Kenyans in his team. So he changed that from 2 hard days, 1 easy day, to 2 easy days, 1 hard day. Nice. And they actually ended up, a couple of years later, I'm not saying it's all down to me. I'm sure they had some good recruitment policy and some good athletes coming through, but they ended up coming much higher in the national ekidens.
Interesting. And I think that's part of it, is like not just putting it down to culture, but also looking at the science and changing a way of being. Because I know in Japan, hard work is everything.
And in some things that obviously will work, but in running, you need to be smart with your body. You can't just keep pushing it the whole time.
So you've travelled all around the world with your running, and I think you mentioned at some point that running is obviously a great way of exploring different places, even if you're just on holiday. Where is your favourite place that you've ever run?
It's a bit of a boring answer, but Iten in Kenya is like when you're, I mean, it's perfect running landscape. It's just these rolling hills. But once you get out of the town and you're in the countryside and all the children are cheering you on, and it's not only that, but if you can, by the end of 6 months, I could last on one of these progression runs. I could last maybe 8K, 10K, and you're in this group of Kenyan runners, and they all run in silence, but such this light rhythm, and it's just as a runner, it's the most incredible experience. Down here in Devon, there's some beautiful runs on Dartmoor and the coastal path here.
I was going to ask about that because you live in such a beautiful part of the British countryside, and yet most of the writing you do is about road running. Would you consider yourself more of a road or a trail runner?
I'd say I'm about 50-50 now. I definitely, so up until my last book, I was definitely a road runner, and I remember when I started writing about trail running and ultra running on Dartmoor, and thinking it was stupid. I kept tripping over and go, who would run here? You can't run. I was like, and then the hills were too steep. This isn't running. I hated it.
This is hiking.
I was like, what is this? And I kept stumbling over rocks. But now I love all that. But you get better at it, and I love dodging. You know, it makes the running much more interesting. I don't think I could still just do road running, but at the same time, I do like every now and then. I run with a running group, the Torbay Triathlon Club, and doing their like mile reps around Painton Green. It seems, some people think that's hell on earth, but I still love that feeling of you're just doing nothing else but running. You're just purely pushing it hard. You don't have to think about where you're going. You're just in this group. So I like both. I think all surfaces, all distances is my...
Variety is the spice of life. It's interesting looking at the best running cultures around the world, because in the grand scheme of things, it's been relatively recently that those people have started to get into running. With the Japanese runners, it is within the last 100 years really, and with the Kenyan runners, it wasn't really until the 80s that they truly started dominating international marathons. What happened within those cultures to get them so into running?
Well, they're two completely different stories. I'll start with the Japanese. Running became a big thing after the Second World War in Japan. The country was completely defeated, had terrible 2 nuclear bombs had landed. So they kind of had to build themselves back up. So they were looking for role models, and long distance running had all the attributes they were looking for, like dedication, commitment, perseverance. And so they started really supporting these marathons and long distance relay races, and the newspapers got behind them, the big newspapers in Japan. And in Japan, the newspapers are huge, way bigger than here, much bigger readership still today. And so they have a huge influence, and so they still today support these biggest races, and they're all, and means they get huge coverage in the newspapers. So it kind of began as part of the rebuilding from the Second World War. And at that time, in the 60s, but by the 50s and 60s, as a result, the Japanese dominated marathon running in the way the Kenyans do today. I mean, the top 10, I think it was in 1962 or something, the top 10 fastest runners of the year were all Japanese in the marathon. They were incredible. The Kenyan story is completely different. Black Africans weren't allowed in the Olympics for many, many years, so the idea of sport was not really existing. But then if you ask any Kenyan runner, why are the Kenyan, where did it begin? They'll all say the same thing, Kip Keino. So Kip Keino was this incredible runner who won 2 Olympic golds in the 1970s, early 1970s. He wasn't actually even the first Kenyan to win, but he won in such an amazing style, in the 1500 meters particularly, that it just kind of sparked this kind of fervor for running. And then that combined with, in 1976, an Irish patrician brother called Brother Colm O'Connell moved to this small school in the middle of nowhere in Kenya, and he started becoming the athletics coach at this school. And then he started setting up these training camps for kids. This school started doing very well nationally in the national championships. So in 1986, they're the first ever World Junior Championship. And they asked Brother Colm O'Connell, because his school team was doing so well, to pick the Kenyan team for the World Championship. And so he took 12 runners from his school, all from one school in Kenya, in the middle of nowhere in Kenya. And they went to the World Junior Championships. And they won 11 medals. And then he was like, okay, we're doing something right here. So from that day forth, he started setting up these, just in the school holidays, these training camps. But as a result, people would come because they wanted to find out what was going on, and they would stay nearby, and shops set up. And then how people built houses because their kids were at the school. It was a boarding school. And the whole town of Iten grew out of this, and the whole running culture, the whole Kenyan training camps culture, which is the basis of the Kenyan system, all came from Brother Colm O'Connell.
That's amazing. I didn't know that story at all. That's
it's an
so
amazing
interesting.
story, I mean, obviously they already, the talent was there. He didn't create these talent, but he recognized the talent.
Yeah.
And he was very clever in the way he nurtured it.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, that's incredible. You mentioned at the very beginning, before I started recording, about your 300-mile race over 6 days. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and what insanity made you sign up for that?
Well, an even bigger insanity made me sign up for it in that I had a plan, which unfortunately is not happening now, to run the Self-Transcendence 3100, which is the world's longest race, 3,100 miles around a half-mile block in New York. So I was planning to run that. To show the organisers that I was worthy of a place, I had to run a 6-day race beforehand, and the goal was to run roughly around 600 kilometres, so 400 miles, just over 400 miles. And so I went to France. There were no 6-day races in the UK, which is a shame because 6-day racing, not many people know, used to be the biggest sport in the world. 6-day running races.
Fascinating.
It was all the way back in the 1870s when there weren't as many sports. But it was front page news, it was front page in New York Times, 6-day race in Madison Square Garden. It was a huge thing. So it's got a long history. But yeah, I had to go to France, and so I did this 6-day race running around this 1 kilometre loop on a campsite in France. And I was aiming to run 400 miles, I only ran 300.
Only 300. Very disappointing.
So it was hellish. It was horrible.
I'm not surprised.
The worst bit was initially it's kind of fun and you talk. Unfortunately, I don't speak very good French, so I was missing out on a lot of conversation. But there was a Spanish speaker. I speak Spanish. There's a couple of Americans. I had my wife and 2 of my kids there. So it's kind of a fun feeling, but obviously that starts to wear. But when it really gets tough is when you go in for a lie down, you go for a sleep. You get up and it's like 4 a.m. and you step out and there's just these people going around this loop at 4 a.m. and you're like, what?
Did you not consider that maybe running in the Alps or somewhere more beautiful might be better?
Yeah, but I had to get the distance to quality. So you can't, running 6 days in the Alps, you're not going to run tough. 400 miles. So.
No, this is true.
And also the race around New York is a flat loop. So I had to kind of do one of these loop races. I mean, weirdly, 1% of me would like to do another one, just partly because I didn't do very well. I did kind of flake out halfway through. I kind of revived near the end, but with the experience of having done it once, I think I could do the 600 kilometers.
That's amazing.
But
incredible. Are you training up for anything at the moment?
Yes. So as a result, I was going to write a book about the Self-Transcendence 3100. So I already had a publishing contract, so it was a little bit of a disaster that I didn't make the distance, and then the organisers, well, they didn't even have to say, I just emailed them and said, okay,
sorry,
I'm not in, I know, you don't have to tell me.
I failed.
So I had to come up with something else, but I feel like I've come up with a really exciting project, which is I'm going to go on a running pilgrimage around Ireland.
Ooh.
So I'm going to run from interesting place to interesting place. It's a modern day pilgrimage, a secular pilgrimage, so the holy places are not only going to be monasteries and churches, although there'll be some of those as well, but like waterfalls, mountains, lots of visitors.
Dog interlude.
And also things like anything that brings people together, so it could be sporting matches, park runs, music, also pub lock-ins. That's what I'm hoping for, some good pub lock-ins.
Love
so
that.
so I'm going to run around Ireland.
How far is that?
Well, I'm mapping it out at the moment, so it's hard to be exact. I'm not going to religiously stick to the coast path because it is, weirdly, even though Ireland's not that big a country, the coast zigs in and out, in and out, in and out. I think it's about 5,000 miles, the whole coast.
Sure.
So I think I'm going to run about 2,000 miles though. So
amazing. How long do you think that will take you?
About 10 weeks.
Nice.
So, yeah, I'm planning not to be running from dusk till dawn, but to have time to have adventures.
Has anyone done that before?
Not that I know of. I mean, there are records from one end of Ireland to the other, or across Ireland.
Yeah, but not the coast.
Not the
kind of road.
Coastal route. But I'm not sticking to a religious route that's going to set a record or anything like that. I'm going to roughly run a marathon a day, I think.
Amazing.
For 10 weeks.
That's great. So your training must be pretty intense already.
Well, it isn't because I've been injured. So I'm in a bit of a... I'm starting to get a bit panicky. I'm due to go in July, barely running 10 miles a week at the moment, but I feel like I might have just cracked the injury. Okay. I had my best run a couple of days ago, where it didn't hurt for the first time. So fingers crossed.
Best feeling.
Yeah, so no, I'm not intense training at all, but also I think I need to be careful and
not overdo it.
So
actually, that brings me back to different running cultures. How do different running cultures cope with injuries?
Kenya's interesting because they don't even despite all the money in running and all the success, they don't really have much good kind of physio treatment and physio facilities. And its brother Colin McConnell told me this. He said there's the line where you get injured and we have to go up to that line, but we can't cross that line, because if we cross that line, it's much harder to rehab in Kenya. They don't have the facilities or the medical doctors. As a result, he says they're much better at listening to their bodies. They sense when something's not right, they ease off. They're also not afraid, they're not sticklers for the schedule.
Yeah.
So if they realise something's not feeling quite right, it's a very different approach. In Japan, if something's not right, it's because you're not training hard enough. You need to train harder.
Yes.
If I'm feeling tired, it's because I'm not training hard enough. Where in Kenya, they'll say, I need to take it easy for a few days. David Rudisha was brother Colin McConnell's star athlete, and I would try and go and see him. And I said, when's he training? He said, well, I don't know. I was like, well, it's like the Olympics coming up. He said, well, he might train tomorrow, depends how he feels. If he wakes up and he doesn't feel like it, he won't do it.
Oh, that's amazing.
Like,
wow. We could all, I think, learn something from that, because one of the reasons that my Epstein-Barr virus got so bad was because I also assumed that the reason that I was feeling so tired on my runs was because I wasn't training hard enough. And so I trained harder and I trained harder and I got worse and worse.
So I don't know if you know Jake Smith. Jake Smith's a young British athlete who was doing incredibly well. And he got sent out to train in Uganda with Joshua Cheptegei and Benjamin Kiplimo, and he was training with those guys. And he came home early from the training, and everyone was a bit like, why was that? So I interviewed him, and he said he was really struggling out there, and he was losing weight. He didn't like the food, and he did end up. He had that thing RED, is it RED?
Yeah, Red S or Reds.
Red S, yeah. So he was not eating enough, and he was very skinny. But he said just before he was leaving, the Ugandan athletes were like, why are you leaving? He said, oh, I'm so tired, I can't train anymore. And they said, we should have taken a rest day.
Yeah.
And he was like, and he said, I didn't even cross my mind that I could have. Right. And they were like, you're tired, just stop, just rest, and then come back in a few days.
I think also they don't place so much emphasis on what the watch says. No. It's very much listen to your body, run how you feel that you should run that day. Yeah. I think we could all learn something from that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk about the mileage that, there's other websites where they'll analyse the training of the Kenyans and stuff, and I do always have to, I think, is that really what they're doing? Because in my experience, they don't use the watch. I know someone who trained, an elite athlete who trained with Eli Kipchoge, and I said, what's the best bit of advice Kipchoge ever gave you? He trained with him for about 5 years.
Right.
He said, don't look at your watch. I said, why are you looking at your watch all the time? so he's not looking at his watch. There's a really funny story where the Nike Breaking 2 project, they gave watches to the 3 athletes. They wanted to analyse the training they were doing. So they wanted to see, make sure they were doing the right training and see what they were doing. They were interested. And they found out that Tadesse, they had him, the Eritrean guy, he was running like 250 miles a week. And they were like, this is incredible. And then they were like, well, we weren't expecting this. And I told this to some Kenyan guys, and they just started laughing. They're like, he's not running 250 miles a week. You know what he's doing? He's getting back from training and his friends are going, wow, look at that amazing watch. Can I have a go? He's like, yeah, have a go. See what it's like. And there's no way he's running 250.
I was going to say, I feel like that's impossible. Amazing, that's brilliant. You mentioned before that you follow a vegetarian diet, and I'd love to touch on not just why you do that, but also any recurring themes across the diets of different running cultures around the world.
Bizarrely, in my experience, the Kenyan runners are nearly all, they're not vegetarian. Like if you ask them, they wouldn't say they're vegetarian, but they're 95% vegetarian. I stayed in one of the training camps for 6 weeks, and meat was served once in 6 weeks. Wow. Partly just because they follow the diet they grew up on, and because they're from the poor rural areas of Kenya. Meat is a luxury. It's something they have at funerals and weddings. Sure. They have one goat. In fact, at one time I was invited to this athlete's home, and we were driving there, and he lived miles out in the middle of nowhere. And my friend Godfrey, who was my kind of guide through everything, a Kenyan guy, he said to me, oh, I told him you were vegetarian. He was so happy. It meant he didn't have to slaughter his one goat. And I was like, God, luckily you told him, because that would have been really bad.
It felt so bad.
They really stripped down diet. It's really simple, really. They barely eat breakfast. Breakfast could either be millet porridge, sometimes it's just dry slices of bread, which is really unappetizing. I have to say, I struggled I was in a training camp for 6 weeks. I went and bought a jar of peanut butter. I used to hide it under my bed, and after the athletes had gone to bed, I'd be eating it. Even though I was doing half the training they were, I was starving the whole time. But they would have very milky, sugary tea for breakfast with maybe some slices of bread or some millet porridge. It's funny because there was one training camp, a different one, had a menu on the wall, and it was completely pointless because every day it was the same meals. and every training camp is the same. For lunch is beans and rice, sometimes with potato or carrot. Occasionally on the fancy camps, we might have some avocado as well. And then in the evening, it's ugali, which is this maize meal. Ugali, which the Kenyans, well, they look around, they say, we're the only people who eat ugali. That must be why we're better than everyone else. So they often call ugali the secret. Ugali and steamed kale, basically.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that is their diet. And they don't snack, they don't have chocolate, they don't have cakes unless it's someone's birthday. But even then, they don't really, the cake is more just to look at. They don't really eat it.
Interesting.
Yeah, they're just very little processed food when you think about it. In fact, and then the kale is all grown in the camps, so they just cut it there. Japan, of course, is famous for its diet. Again, not much meat, although they do eat a lot of fish. But they also, breakfast was, for me, when I went on the training camps, breakfast was interesting because it was like rice and miso soup and seaweed. And I was like, oh,
give me some sugar.
I realise we're so conditioned in the West to have a sweet meal for breakfast. And yeah, they eat a lot of fermented food in Japan. The natto, the fermented soybeans, and the miso is really good for the gut bacteria. So yeah, I think I lost, without intentionally trying to lose weight, I lost a lot of weight in Japan. I don't think I was too light. I went down to a really good weight to run. And actually, I broke all my PBs after being in Kenya, but I broke them all again after being in Japan. And I think a lot of that was from the diet, because I wasn't really training that hard in Japan. But I came back leaner. There was one time I went to this kind of Western style restaurant in Japan. Everything's smaller in Japan. Cars are smaller, houses are smaller, people are smaller, portion sizes are smaller. And it was quite illustrative though. It was a kind of Western style. It was a vegetarian, I got a veggie burger. It was quite rare. I was mainly eating Japanese food, except at home we were cooking our normal food. You could get a side order of chips, and I hadn't had chips since I'd been in Japan, so I thought, I'll get the side order of chips. And they came in a little cup about that size with 3 chips in it. That was the side order of chips in Japan. So there you go.
Amazing.
If you want to know why Japan is so healthy.
So effectively, the recurring theme there is a lot of whole foods, carbohydrates, and then complete proteins with a lot of vegetables, basically.
Yeah, exactly. In some ways, very similar, and not too much processed food.
Yeah, interesting.
I mean, it does exist in Japan, but obviously it's much easier to avoid it.
Yeah.
They do have fast food restaurants, but they're not everywhere. If you go to a train station or something, there's lots of good Japanese food you can buy very easily.
Yeah, whereas train station food here is not the one.
It's impossible. It's like a sandwich is the best you're going to get.
Yeah, exactly. Most of your writing, at least in your books, is about elite runners. Do you think the lessons learned there can be applied to us mere mortals?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I think I'm the representative for the non-elite runners. I mean, and particularly in the ultra running. I mean, in marathon running, I'm probably not anywhere near the elites, but a bit further near the front. But yeah, in ultra running, I tend to struggle. And the further the race went, the further near the back of the field I was. So yeah, I do tell those stories. But yeah, I think there's a lot to learn. I think things like the 80-20 training. I just generally think when I come up with a training quandary, it's like, what would the Kenyans do? Like, I'm tired, I should rest. Okay. I should run on trails more. I should run my easy runs slowly. All these things I think are good for anyone to pay attention to. Good diet, get lots of sleep. The Kenyans, I stayed in these training camps. By 9:30, everyone was asleep. I was always the last one to go to bed.
I think I could live there. I think I'd do very well.
The first run, for some reason, always begins at 5:50.
Oh, I take it back.
And they're very punctual as well.
Yeah.
Weirdly, Kenyans generally are not punctual in life, and there's a coach has a nice saying. He says, the Westerners have the watches, the Kenyans have the time. That's his thing, he says. But when it comes to running, they start the runs at 5:50. If you're there at 5:51, they've gone. It's amazing.
Interesting.
They're so punctual with the running. But yeah, no, I never got to the bottom of why 5:50 and not 6.
So plenty to learn. I think that's a good note to end on, because there's so many lessons that you share in your books, but I think that kind of summarizes all of it, is sort of like, listen to your body, more is less.
Yeah.
That's kind of it.
Yeah, a lot of it's common sense. I mean, the Kenyan secret, as Brother Colm said, the secret is there is no secret. I mean, they just train sensibly, they train, they do have a lot of advantages in numbers and physical conditions and, the lifestyle they lead, but at the same time, there's no magic. Yeah. There was no magic formula that you could just place in there. A lot of it was just common sense,
Nice.
and listening to your body.
I have some quick fire questions for you. We'll see how quick fire they are.
I'm not very
No one
quick
ever,
fire.
no, but no one ever does these quick fire. But I'm going to give it a go. Okay.
Okay.
What are your go-to running shoes?
Probably my Hoka Speed Goats at the moment. Not always that,
choice.
but yeah, I do like them.
What's your favourite time of day to run?
I think the evening, dusk. I love the feeling of running in the morning. Means you carry that feeling with you the whole day. You feel good the whole day. But I actually always feel a bit stiff, a bit ginger in the morning. But sometimes I find in the evening I suddenly just have this energy. I'd set out for an easy run and I suddenly find myself running twice as fast.
Yeah, interesting.
And like, yes, this feels great.
What's your favourite post-run snack?
So I have this Vela Forte mix, which I also mix with frozen. So it's raspberry and acai, and I mix it with frozen strawberries, a bit of sugar, and oat milk, and blend that up. And I actually, when I'm running, I can kind of be thinking about that.
I have a rule: you're not allowed to think about food until the last 5k of a run.
Yeah, exactly.
Hummus or guacamole?
Hummus.
Good shout. If you weren't a runner, what sport would you do?
Probably tennis. I quite like tennis. I did love football when I was younger, but I found playing it as an adult a bit stressful.
Sure, yeah. Name one thing that makes you happy every day.
Giving my wife a hug when she comes home from work.
That's sweet. I love that. That's really good. Most people say their pets
Yeah, I
or
don't have a
porridge
pet.
or something.
No, when she comes home from work, yeah, that's a nice
lovely.
moment. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much for joining me here today. And I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it, please do give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. I'll be back next week with more running content, and let me know in the comments below what you enjoyed most from this video. Thank you so much for joining.
It's a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.